Okay. So all you need to see is myself at the moment.
No, but
And
you're supposed to
Dror,
see the
who I
people,
will
and we
introduce
only see
in a
a
moment.
few.
We can't see you.
Can't
You're
see
not
me.
coming up large.
We can see you.
It says video disabled.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to see Paul Charney or Dror Yamini, on the top of your screen from the right side, you
No,
can
it's not
choose the
working.
speaker
Yes,
view.
I know, but
Still not
we want to
working.
see the people as well. We can't see the people. It's all blanks.
We can't start the video. We can mute ourselves, but we can't start the videos.
But you don't need to start the video. You just need to see Dror Yamini or
No,
Paul Charney.
I know, but we like
Speaker view is not working. We should be able to have a big view of Paul. We haven't.
If you would like to see the big view of Paul, you need to speak. You need to put
I
your
know.
mode
It's
on the
not
speaker
working.
view.
I know, but it's not.
but it's not working.
Okay, Paul. Once Paul will start speak, you will see them.
Okay.
No, he was
Everybody
speaking.
see-
We couldn't see him.
Can everybody see me now?
No.
Please,
Speaker view.
Wait, I can see you, but I can't see my friends.
okay.
No,
I
you can't see anyone.
let's
Could
continue
you
the
stop
discussion.
arguing? Could you stop arguing? They've chosen not to show us everybody.
No, we can't.
Team, if you could mute everybody. Some of the videos you'll be able to see and some people you won't be able to see, but tonight's special speaker, Dror Yamini, who I'm going to introduce, you will be able to see.
I can't.
Dror, okay.
Hi.
Ben,
Hi.
let me tell you a little bit about Dror.
Just Paul, just one technical remark. If you please can connect me, if you are the host, to the share screen, because I have a
I will.
presentation.
Yes, I will connect you, Dror, for a moment. You will be co-host. And
Okay.
You can do everything.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yes.
Me too.
Now
Me
you
too. I
co-host.
can't see him. Me too. Emma Gazal. I can't see.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Dror tonight. Dror, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit about you so that everyone knows just a little bit about your history, and then when we'll allow you to come in. Dror Yamini was born in Tel Aviv to a Yemenite Jewish family, studied humanities and history at Tel Aviv University, and then pursued a degree in law. After graduation, Dror worked as an advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Immigration and Absorption and became a spokesperson at the ministry. In 1984, Dror began his career as a journalist, a well-known journalist in Israel. His book, Political Punch, is a critique of politics in society in Israel. Between 2003 and 2014, Yemini has been the opinion page editor for the Ma'arif. In 2014, Yemini began writing for the daily Yediot Ahronot. In 2014, he published the book, The Industry of Lies, a worthwhile read, if I might add, dealing with the lack of accountable reporting in contemporary media. Most of the newspaper articles are intended to refute what Dror regards as anti-Israel claims. Dror has published many articles about the Israeli-Arab conflict in which he examines the issues of genocide, refugees, Palestinian and Arab capital, the status of Israeli Arabs, multiculturalism, and the status of women. So without me going on too much about Dror, I'm going to, without any hesitation or delay, introduce you to our fantastic and esteemed guest tonight. Dror, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting me. Now, everyone can see me? Everything is okay?
Yes.
Okay, and you see the presentation?
Yes.
Just asking, just to be sure. Okay, so good evening again. In order to understand the whole story of NAKBA, the Jewish NAKBA in general, we must have a kind of historical background of what is a story, what was in that time. I guess some of the things that I will show you, some of you know, some of you maybe don't know, just I want to put them in a context, in a way. So just to bear in mind that, just a minute, I want the presentation to work, and it's not working yet, just a minute. Okay, now it's much better. Anyway, in order to understand what we are talking about, just to bear in mind that when Zionism began, it was the age of empires. I mean, most of the world was ruled actually by empires, not by states. And empires, one by one, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire that you see now on the screen, and later on Yugoslavia, it was a kind of empire, all collapsed. And actually, in order to understand why Zionism, we have to remember that Jews were persecuted in many places around the world, in the West, in the East, in the Arab countries, in the Muslim countries. And many people strived for one thing, for independence, for liberation. They did not want to be ruled by empires, by foreign powers. So a huge war, a huge campaign was in order to achieve this kind of independence. And we cannot understand, for example, the Balfour Declaration without understanding the idea of self-determination that began to prevail. Now, the Balfour Declaration was at the end of the First World. Before the Balfour Declaration, there was something of that kind by the Foreign Ministry of France, actually, a letter that is recognizing the right of Jews for self-determination. Later on, at the beginning of 1918, there was the very famous declaration of Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States in that time, the 14 points. To conclude them is to say that here is the American superpower recognizing the self-determination. So the whole idea of Zionism and the whole idea of nation state and the whole idea of self-determination was part of the background of the time. And when other peoples strived for self-determination, Jews were part of the story. They also wanted in the very same time, because other people could argue, yes, we are persecuted by the superpowers, by the empires, but Jews were persecuted more than other people because they were persecuted as a minority, they were persecuted as people that because of anti-Semitism, of course, were persecuted all the time. So they wanted, just like other peoples, they wanted self-determination. And at the beginning, there was not any conflict with the Arabs. Just to bear in mind that the leader of the Arabs in that time, Hussein ibn Ali, welcomed the Jews who are coming to Palestine. In that time, it was not even Palestine, but anyway, they were welcomed. In 1919, there was even an agreement between Chaim Weitz, one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, and the son of Ibn Ali. Again, they welcomed the Jews. You can see in the map what was allocated for the Jews in the agreement with the Arabs. Of course, that it did not work out eventually. And what was in Palestine in that time? When we look at the map from the Ottoman time, we cannot see any Palestine because there was not any Palestine. Palestine was not the name that was used, not by Jews and not by Arabs in that time. And excuse me? And there were districts that were called Sanjaks or Waliyat, but you will not find the name Palestine in the Ottoman Empire. But what was actually in Palestine in that time? There are many testimonies about what was in that piece of land. The most reliable research about that time when Zionism began was of the PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, that was established in 1865 in Britain, in London actually. And this fund sent a big group of scholars, archaeologists and others, in order to explore this piece of land. And this is, I guess, as I said, the most reliable testimony. This is, for example, the map that they published. They published a lot of maps of Palestine. This is a map of Jerusalem. That's what we had in that time, in the 60s, 70s, 80s of the 19th century, was only the old city of today. You can see now Tel Aviv. There was not any Tel Aviv, there was only Jaffa. And Jaffa was the very small place that is with red. I hope you can see it in the left of the map. All around what you see was actually orchards. There was not any Tel Aviv. And when the idea of self-determination began to prevail, the outcome was nation states. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, and now as a nation state, a huge wave of population exchange took place. For example, between Turkey and Greece, there was a population exchange of almost 2 million people. When we are speaking about Germany at the end of the Second World War, we are speaking about something like 12 million people who were forced out from all the neighboring countries. And Poland, Ukraine, for example, we are speaking about 1.4 million people who became refugees. And it kept on and on and on. India, Pakistan, in 1948, the same year of the NAKBA here in Palestine, we are speaking about 7 million people from each side that became refugees, 14 million people. Cyprus, even in the second half of the previous century, we are speaking about 250,000 people that became refugees. And so on and so on. Armenia and Azerbaijan, more than 1 million people became refugees in the 80s of the last century. Altogether, only in the Balkans, we are speaking about 7 million people who became refugees. Now, practically, because of the collapse of empires, because of the establishing of nation states, the nation state did not want a lot of minorities. And the outcome was a huge wave of expulsions, population exchange. Now, in that time, in history, it was not only something that practically was carried out, it was also the norm. This person, for example, Fridtjof Nansen, he received Nobel Prize for peace because he promoted the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. The highest international court of that time, Permanent Court of International Justice, decided upon that this is the best way in order to achieve peace. And it went on. The Peel Commission, the first commission that of the British mandate in 1937, decided upon that the best way to solve the conflict between Jews and Arabs will be population exchange between the two groups. The Labour Party of Britain in 1944 decided upon that population exchange must take place in order to achieve, to solve the conflict between Jews and Arabs. Winston Churchill may be the most important leader in that time, in the 40s, declared in the British Parliament in 1944, expulsion is the method which will be the most satisfactory and lasting. There will be no mixture of populations to cause endless trouble. A clean sweep will be made. I'm not allowed by these transferences. Now, not only Western leaders, also local leaders, even among the Arabs. I'm not saying Palestinians because in that time, Palestinians were only the Jews. It's a bit confusing, I know, but in that time, during the British mandate, my parents who grew up under the British mandate, they were Palestinians. The people who we call today Palestinians in that time defined themselves as Arabs, not as Palestinians. Musa Alami, one of the leaders of the Arabs in that time, he said, yes, if there will be any Jewish state or whatever, it will be without Arabs. Nouri al-Said, the prime minister of Iraq in that time, also declared that there will not be mix of population and population exchange will take place. And we can go on and on and on with other Arab leaders who had the same kind of declarations. Potsdam Agreement, for example, at the end of the Second World War, they decided upon to expel all the ethnic Germans from all the neighboring countries. Only in Europe, in that time, after the Second World War, we are speaking about 20 million people who were forced out from their homelands. And before we get to the NAKBA, we have to bear in mind that the leader of the Arabs in Palestine, the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, collaborated with Germany, with Hitler. And he even wrote in his memoirs, our fundamental condition to cooperating with Germany, with the Nazi Germany, was a free hand to eradicate every last Jew from Palestine and the Arab world. And all the Arab leaders of the time actually declared, if the Jewish state becomes a fact, the Arab peoples will drive the Jews who live in their midst into the sea. Here we get to the Jewish NAKBA. The Jews from Arab countries are becoming the hostages. They are going to pay the price for establishing a Jewish state. And Abdul Rahman Azam, the Secretary General of the Arab League, declared in that time, this will be before the war, the independence war. This will be a war of extermination. And it went on and on and on by Arab leaders. If the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, they might be responsible for the massacre of large number of Jews. Here are the threats against the Jews from Arab countries. And it went on and on and on. It should be remembered that there will be as many Jews in the Arab world as there are in Palestine, whose position might become very dangerous. And it went on and on and on. Threats against the Jews in Arab countries. The Arab League decided upon against the Jews in Arab countries. I mean, in many cases, they were not involved in the Zionist project. They had nothing to do with it. And yet, they were declared as the people who are going to pay the price. And it did not begin actually with Zionism. We can now show again and again that Jews in Arab countries were persecuted again and again before Zionism, during Zionism, and after Israel was established. Again and again and again. We do not have time to cover all the cases. The New York Times declared in the headline, the day after Israel was established, Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands. And yes, Arabs invaded the very day after the declaration, the 15th of May, 1948. And in that time, nobody knew what is going to happen if Jews, Israel will be able to survive or not. And what we know is that in many Arab countries, there were massacres and pogroms against Jews. In Iraq, I'll give you just some example. The Farhud, 175 people were massacred. It was in 41, before Israel even was established. And it was organized by the Mufti, who was the leader of the Arabs of Palestine. He escaped to Iraq, and from Iraq he went to Germany, to Berlin. And it kept on. In Egypt, many waves of massacres and pogroms against Jews. It went on in Aden, when 82 Jews were killed in a huge massacre. It went on in Syria, in some places. It went on in Libya, where Jews were massacred again and again. Morocco, they suffered much less, but yet there was a massacre. And when we go to history, we can see some images from what happened to the Jews in Morocco after a pogrom in 1912, or in Iraq, in Baghdad, the Farhud in 1941, or in Aden of Yemen in 48. It kept on and on and on and on. Altogether, when we are speaking about NAKBA, we have to remember that yes, many Arabs, 711,000, became refugees. Now, because of the war, because of the independence war, not because Israel or the David Ben-Gurion actually wanted to expel them. It was not the story. The story was that Israel had to defend itself after the so many threats, after the invasion, after the declarations about extermination. And yes, they became refugees. Now, we have to remember that according to the scholars, most of them escaped. Only about between 30 to 35% were expelled during the battles. But it happened. We cannot ignore it. From the other hand, there was a bigger number of Jews who were forced out from Arab countries, the Jewish NAKBA. And right now, I guess that all of you know that if we are speaking about the Palestinian NAKBA, we know that in every library, in every university, you can find many shelves of books about the Palestinian NAKBA. How many books were written about the Jewish NAKBA? Almost zero. There are very, very few. Lynn Julius, some of you, I guess, know her, wrote a book. Martin Gilbert wrote a book about the Jews in Arab countries, but very, very few, actually. So the story of the Jewish NAKBA was totally ignored by scholars, totally ignored by journalists. It does not exist almost. When Jews arrived to Israel, they lived in what we called ma'abarot, which mean transit camp, which mean actually refugee camps. They lived there in the 50s. But they are not refugees anymore. It does not exist anymore. Now, when we get to how the international media is covering the story, of the Independence Day of Israel. We just celebrated it some weeks ago. For Israel, an anniversary. For Palestinians, a NAKBA. This is the New York Times, for example. And it's going on. And we see this kind of propaganda about the return. As we all know, the most important story of Palestinians until today is the return, the right of return. All the demonstrations that took place in the last 2-3 years in the Gaza border were not about peace. They were about return. And that's what they carry many times, these peaceful demonstrations as they are defined by the international media. If now, many times we can read about how Israel actually confiscated the property of the Palestinians. If we check the facts, we find out that actually what Jews left behind, what was confiscated from Jews, speaking about lands and property, was of a much higher value comparing to the property that was left behind by the Palestinians. But it is, as I told you, totally forgotten. When we speak all together about what happened in the previous century, we find out that speaking about that time, 60 million people became refugees. 60 million people because of population exchange, because of ethnic cleansing. Out of the 60 million people from that time, no one actually is a refugee today. It's over. Ethnic Germans, they are not refugees anymore. They integrated to Germany. People from Poland, people from Ukraine, people from the Balkans, people from Turkey, people from Greece, and so on, all integrated. The only one group that is perpetuated as refugees is the Palestinian one. Right now, we are speaking, according to UNRWA, about 5.5 million people. Now, when we look at what happened in other conflicts, we find out that that so many people actually, when we speak about population exchange, it's not that people wanted to leave their homelands. They were forced to leave, and they were forced to leave by many massacres. Armenians, which is the worst case, 90% of the people who were expelled actually were killed, died during the expulsion. And the Greeks, they're speaking about 60%, and so on and so on. Actually, when we check, when we compare what happened in the conflict between Israel and the Arabs in Palestine, we find out that among the Arabs who became refugees, only less than 2% were killed. Now, when we read about what happened in the NAKBA, we can read so many scholars writing about the crime against humanity that Israel committed. Needless to say, it's a lie. It's a lie because in that time, it was not only practically carried out, it was the norm. In that time, people were forced out as part of the struggle against empires. Now, the whole idea of Zionism, the whole idea of self-determination is an idea which is anti-colonialist, because the whole story of, for example, even the Mandat is a story of ending the rule of superpowers, ending the rule of empires, and giving the people self-determination. And we have to ask ourselves, how come that all the other refugees are not refugees anymore? How come that the people from India, from Pakistan, from Germany, from Poland, from Ukraine, how come that they are not refugees? In order to understand what happened from that time until today, we have to remember that the UN General Assembly established two agencies, not one. One is the UNHCR, which is taking care for all the refugees in the world. But it was not good for the Arabs. And all the Arab delegates in that time, in 49, they asked from the General Assembly to establish another agency which will be dedicated only for the Palestinians. And that's exactly what happened. 5 days after the UN established the UNHCR, the UN established UNRWA. Now, the whole story is that the definition of a refugee of UNHCR is one, and the definition of a refugee in UNRWA is another one. Actually, many times people tell Israel that Israel should behave according to the international norms. And I'm always saying, yes, that's exactly what should be, but for both sides. You cannot have one definition for a refugee to the whole world, including to the Jews who were expelled during the Jewish NAKBA, and another definition only for the Arabs from Palestine. They were not even yet Palestinians in that time. They were Arabs from Palestine. And you can find out the paradox between UNRWA and the UNHCR. The UNHCR is helping people out of their refugee status. That's exactly what Israel did during the 50s to the Jews who came as refugees from Arab countries. But UNRWA is doing just the opposite. UNRWA helps people to preserve their refugee status. And it's going on and on and on. Status of refugee is not given to all offspring in the UNHCR, but it's the opposite in UNRWA. And the outcome, the result is that the UNHCR helped 50 million people to restart their lives. They are not refugees anymore. UNRWA began with 711,000, and right now they have more than 5 million people. And right now, so many people again and again say, oh, it's all because of the crimes that Israel committed in that time. But we have to look many times at the testimonies of people from that time. For example, the Prime Minister of Syria, since 48, he wrote it. We have been demanding the return of refugees to their homes. But we ourselves, we are the people who encourage them to leave, not Israel, not Zionists. And even the testimony of Abu Mazen himself, he published an article in 76 in the magazine Al-Tawra, and he admitted that the Arab armies forced them, the Arabs from Palestine, to emigrate and to leave their homeland. And we know what was the outcome. He did not even blame Israel. And it's going on and on and on and on. The UN General Assembly decided upon that refugees, Jews and Arabs, should be integrated. Jews from the Jewish NAKBA should be integrated in Israel. Arabs should be integrated in the local states where they are. And just to think about it, because Arabs who came from Palestine, for example, when they arrived to Syria or to Lebanon, they had the same culture, they had the same language, they had the same religion, they had the same food, many times same families. So there was not any problem of being integrated, but the Arab world did not want to integrate them. when we ask ourselves, how comes that Palestinian NAKBA became the leading ethnic cleansing in the world, and nobody is writing so many books or articles about the so many other NAKBAs, including the Jewish NAKBA. We have to remember that, for example, Ilan Pape, an Israeli scholar, and he published the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that became the Bible in many universities about the conflict between Jews and Arabs, between Jews and Palestinians. And his book is full of lies. When we read the review of Professor Benny Morris about the book of Ilan Pape, who became a hero, he wrote that in every chapter, actually, in every page almost, he found distortions, large and small. But this book of Pape became the Bible about the conflict. When Pape himself admitted that he is actually lying, the struggle is about ideology, not about facts. We try to convince as many people as we can. We do it because of ideological reasons, not because we are truth seekers. It's unbelievable that in the scholarship of today, people even admit, yes, we are lying because we have our political bias. When we get to nowadays and how people look at what happened in that time, you find out people like Robert Fisk. I guess you know the name even better than me. When he wrote about an article about the rockets from Gaza, he actually justified the Hamas, because he wrote, so when you hear Israelis speak about the terrorists firing rockets into Israel, the Palestinians in Gaza can say, in many cases, that they are coming from families who left Palestine in 48, which means that what they are doing in launching rockets is justified. The same, by the way, the same justification is expressed in Israeli newspaper by Israeli scholars. Launching rocket from Gaza and so on must be an attempt to remind the world that Israel and also the Palestinian leadership, that the refugee question is still alive and kicking. Now, it is very interesting to read Fisk and other scholars giving this kind of justification, because nobody will justify ethnic German who will launch rockets to Czech Republic or to Poland because in 45 he was expelled from his village. Nobody will justify a Jew that was forced out from Alexandria or from Damascus, that if he will launch rockets. The only justification that some scholars find is to what the Hamas is doing to Israel. It's over, it's finished. And yet you find out that so many scholars are looking for this kind of justifications. Or actually it is, when I read this kind of scholars, I remember what George Orwell said. Some ideas are so stupid that they can be expressed only by intellectuals. And it's go on. When we see this kind of propaganda, Corbyn, for example, speaking about what? About exist, resist, and return. To those of you who do not understand the word, resist, it's mean terror. Return, it's mean the right of return, which is defined by the Palestinians as the right to end the existence of Israel. And it's going on and on and on. Now, the whole story of refugees, Arabs and Jews, Jewish NAKBA and Palestinian NAKBA, actually became the main obstacle to peace. When Clinton put his own proposal on the table, 2 states for 2 peoples, 67 borders almost. When he put it, for the first time in history, actually, Arab leaders decided to accept the Clinton plan. Now, it was a turning point. It was a turning point because we have to bear in mind that for so many years, Arab states were not willing to accept Israel as the Jewish state. The Clinton plan recognized Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. And for the first time, Arab states accepted the idea of a Jewish state. And it was mainly thanks to the people, the men that you see here in the picture, Bandar Ben Sultan. Bandar Ben Sultan was a very close friend of Clinton. They went together to vacations, they played golf together, and so on and so on. And he was also the ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Washington. And he convinced, in that time, the Arab leaders to accept the Clinton plan. The point is that when Arafat came to Washington in order to deliver the Palestinian response to the Clinton plan, he met Bandar Ben Sultan and other ambassadors. And Bandar Ben Sultan told him, it was in Rich Hotel in Washington, if we lose this opportunity, it is not going to be a tragedy. This is going to be a crime. Unfortunately, as we all know today, Arafat went to the White House and committed both a crime and a tragedy. And what was his main excuse? We cannot accept a proposal that does not secure the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, which means our problem is not the 67 borders. Our problem is not occupation. Our problem is Israel itself. What we need is that millions will get back to, the refugees will go back to Israel. And it was the same with Abu Mazen in 2008, when Condoleezza Rice told him, we have a great proposal by Ehud Olmert. And his response was the same. I cannot tell 4 million Palestinians that only 5,000 of them can go home. It is very strange because, as I told you, there was not any group of refugees who received the right of return to go to their homeland. It didn't happen after a huge wave and many waves actually of population exchange. The only one people that is demanding this kind of right of return is the Palestinian people. And it's going on and on and on by so many Arab leaders. We don't have time to see all of it. And here is Nabil Shat, one of the Palestinian leaders, declaring, we will never accept the 2 states for 2 peoples solution to the conflict. Again, the main reason is the refugees. The main reason is that the NAKBA. They accept the idea of 2 states. They do not accept the idea of 2 states for 2 peoples. Because 2 states for 2 peoples, it means a Jewish homeland and a Palestinian homeland. 2 states, it means a Palestinian state and a state that will be Palestinian by the right of return. And when you hear them from the beginning, when it happened, one by one, they explained that the right of return is the demand that will put end to the very existence of Israel. The Arab League decided upon the President Jamal Abdel Nasser, if the refugees return to Israel, Israel will cease to exist. And the same, the senior advisor to Yasser Arafat, Shakir Habas, who declared the right of return is the winning card for the end of Israel. It's very interesting because Israel never used the question of the Jewish Nakba in order to tell the Arabs that there will not be peace until the Arab states will compensate all the Jews who were forced out from Arab countries. But you find out that the Arabs are using the excuse of the refugees in order to actually fail any kind of peace initiative. And we can see, for example, one of the leading intellectuals in the United States, Professor John Mearsheimer, who wrote again and again, the Nakba is one of the great crimes of modern history. Let me tell you something. I asked him, dear Professor Mearsheimer, how can you define the Nakba is one of the great crimes of modern history when we had also the Jewish Nakba and more people were forced out and they did not declare war on the hosting states? How comes that he says that the Nakba was one of the great crimes when actually 60 million people were forced out and much more people were killed? He did not answer me. But this intellectual published an article in the New York Times where he wrote, during the Yugoslavian war in the 90s, ethnically homogeneous states must be created. It would require transferring populations. It's very interesting. When we are speaking about Israel, it's one of the great crimes of modern history. When we are speaking about other conflicts, he is recommending it to carry out more and more transfers. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not recommending and I'm not supporting any transfer. All what I'm saying is that in that time, speaking about the 40s and before, speaking about the time of the Palestinian Nakba and of the Jewish Nakba, it was the norm. It happened in every conflict. Now, if someone will declare what Churchill declared in that time, he will be sent to the criminal international court. Now, it is defined as a crime against humanity, but not in that time. And when people do not speak about the background, when people do not say what really happened in that time, when people ignore history and background and the norms of the time, they can, one, blame Israel that Israel committed a crime, and mainly, they totally ignore the fact that we are speaking about actually population exchange. Yes, Palestinian Nakba and the Jewish Nakba. And without understanding the very fact that that's what happened in that time, we will never be able to achieve a real settlement and reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. I don't know if I have more time because I want to leave some time for questions if you have. I spoke enough. Okay, thank you so much for listening.
Dror, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. We've got a number of questions, if you don't mind, we're going to ask you just to pick a few for you, if that's okay. All yes, very fascinating okay. Stuff. One of the questions we've had is the right to compensation. First of all, have you seen any so-called Palestinian refugees make a claim for monetary or other compensation from Israel? And in the other way, do you think it's worthwhile Jews who suffered being exiled from their states in the Arab world making a claim for compensation in their homelands?
Okay, let me tell you something. There is a kind of legal process which is taking place in many places. For example, in Central Europe, speaking about ethnic Germans that were forced out from the Sudetenland. That's how you say it in English, Sudetenland, you know, from the German part of the Czech Republic. Nobody received compensation. Somehow they always found a way to tell them that they cannot receive compensation. There were some lawsuits of Jews in Egypt. And an Egyptian court decided upon, it was Metzger family, I think. Yes, the name was Metzger, that they have the right to receive compensation for a hotel that they owned before they were expelled. But the ruling was never actually was carried out by the Egyptian government, never. There was not any loose, I don't know about, I don't think that there was any process in other countries because it is impossible. Speaking about Iraq, speaking about Sudan, the 4 rich communities of Jews were in Egypt, in Sudan, in Iraq, and in Syria. And the only one place that something was beginning was Egypt, but as I told you, there is one ruling, it was never implemented.
Do you think there are any claims that Jews can make from the Arab leaders to stay on their lands, even their properties, if they have documentation?
They can prepare, because as we all know, for every single claim of a Jew about what he left behind and what was confiscated from him in Arab countries, there are something like thousands of documents of Palestinians. If you really calculate what Jews left behind, speaking about property, speaking about money, speaking about lands, it is of a much higher value. I mean, there are some researches that were published about it. But nobody really thinks that it can be achieved. So yes, it should be done. It should be somehow be registered or whatever. I mean, I know that there is one ministry here in Israel that is dealing with it, but I don't think that the solution will come from this way. It should come by the way of telling students, telling scholars, you cannot ignore the Jewish NAKBA. You cannot ignore the fact that Jews were forced out. You cannot ignore the fact that property was confiscated. That's what we have to say. To tell you that there is any chance to receive the property back, I don't think so. I don't think. Thinking about what's happening in Syria and other places, and Egypt, which is highly poor, and Iraq, there is no way to receive compensation. I don't think so, unfortunately.
We see this argument being made around the world. Have you seen any government or official accept this as an argument? Have you seen the United Nations accept the Jewish NAKBA? Have we seen anywhere that the work that you are doing and others are doing to try and get this take hold? Is it taking hold anywhere? And what else should we be doing?
The first leader that recognized actually the Jewish NAKBA was Bill Clinton. He spoke about it, and he said that when we will begin to speak about compensations, it should be for both sides. He recognized. He was the first. I mean, frankly, I can tell you that he did it much more than some Israeli leaders. Unfortunately, Israeli leaders, maybe because they are coming from, most of them from Eastern European countries, they totally ignored, we have to admit it, the whole story of the Jewish NAKBA. It's changing. In the last 10 years, it's changing. My contribution was the article that I published something like 15 years ago, titled The Jewish NAKBA. I think the first time that this definition was used, I think it was in my article. and something began, but it's not enough. You hear again and again Palestinians speaking about the Palestinian NAKBA. You do not hear enough. Yes, of course, I give lectures in many American universities, in research institutions, and I give lectures to parliaments. I do speak about it. I do speak about it quite a lot. And there are some other people who speak about it. I mentioned Lynn Julius, but not enough, not enough. We have to do much more, not in order to put obstacles to peace, just the opposite. And when I say it also to my Palestinian friends. Enough to delude yourself with the fantasy of the right of return. Nobody received it. Jews were expelled from Arab countries. Enough. It's over. It's part of the past. But we have to say it and we have to emphasize it just in order to understand that we are speaking about one more event of population exchange, just like what happened in so many conflicts in that time.
In your opinion, what does the future hold for UNRWA? And if UNRWA is not going to last for however long you think it's going to last, what will then happen to the numbers on the refugee status for Palestinians?
Unfortunately, the only one place that thinks are taking seriously is in Washington, in the Congress, not in Israel. Not in Israel. I mean, it's a kind of tragedy that Israel is not really dealing with it. But in Washington, it was decided upon, even during the Obama time, to begin to inquire what is the story with them. How comes that we give them so much money and actually what they do with the money is just to perpetuate the problem and incitement in their textbooks and so on. So they began a process of checking, and one of the outcomes was that Donald Trump, I do not admire him. I don't want to go now to politics, but one of the things that I support that he did is to stop to fund UNRWA. Enough. UNRWA is the problem. UNRWA is not the solution.
So we see the numbers continue to grow, Palestinian refugees. As a new Palestinian is born, so if he becomes an automatic refugee. Is there any way, if we at least try and work on one part of UNRWA, do you think that's a battle worth fighting for?
Yeah, it's a good question because two research conducted in Lebanon, which is the biggest place of refugees, half a million almost, according to UNRWA. And it is very interesting. The two research, one was by a university in Beirut, and one was a census of the Interior Ministry in Lebanon. The two of them found actually that we don't have any 500,000. We have something like 170,000, which means something like 35% of what UNRWA is arguing, which means that it's all based on lies. Speaking about the refugees in Jordan, they are citizens of Jordan. How come that you speak about Palestinians in Jordan when they are Jordanians with ID card? It's against the rules of the definition of a refugee. If you're a citizen, you cannot be a refugee. So we have to expose the so many contradictions and paradox and lies about the whole story. But as we all know, it is used mainly as a propaganda against Israel. And we have to expose the realities. We have to expose the truth. We have to expose the research, not as a propaganda. But the moment that we stop this kind of propaganda, the moment that we expose the realities about the Jewish NAKBA and the Palestinian NAKBA, we passed halfway to achieve reconciliation. That's why, and when at least me, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, when I'm speaking about Jewish NAKBA and other issues against the industry of lies, it's not because I'm against peace. To the contrary, it's because I'm willing to make peace. I'm willing to concessions. I'm not, don't tell anybody because nobody hears. I am not a right winger in Israel. I'm not a big supporter of this government. So whatever I'm doing is first in order that people will know. And second, yes, I'm pro-Palestinian as I am pro-Israeli.
We see some organizations, people organizing talks about Jewish refugees from Palestinian lands here, but we haven't seen a hugely organized coalition of people come together to do that. Do you think it's worthwhile, Jews from different lands, from Arab lands, coming together and maybe creating a seminar and trying to get the word out there?
I think that there are some organizations that are trying to be a kind of an umbrella organization in order to include a lot of, I'm invited to speak in many places for many NGOs in some places. There is Jimena, and there is the organization Wojak, and there are some. They don't have so many millions of dollars, or to put it in the right way, hundreds of millions of dollars as the Palestinians do, and they don't have the support of the Israeli government. Okay, lately Israeli government is beginning to understand that it is something that we should speak about and we should expose, but not enough, so things are happening. I'm not a good organizer, otherwise I would do it, but people should do it. I limit myself to research and lecturing, but yes, it should be done. It should be done. It can be part of the way in order to achieve a global awareness to the real facts. Yes.
Ben-Dror, do you think religion plays a part of this, not just political and ideological?
Yes, of course. Jews were persecuted in many Arab countries because they were Jews. They were considered dhimmis, which mean in a way protected but inferior, to make it short. And they were persecuted even before Zionism. They were, I mean, in sometimes just as Bernard Lewis, the great historian, or Martin Gilbert, as they defined it, and they did it better than I did. It was not as bad as in the Christian countries. But it was not as good as some people imagine. Yes, Jews were. My story is that my grandmother actually, when she was very young, she escaped from Yemen. She escaped, and she had no idea. 100 years ago, at the end of the First World War, she had no idea what Zionism is. She did not know about the Zionist movement, but she had to escape because Jews were persecuted in Yemen. And she escaped with a group of Jews to Port Said in Egypt, and from Port Said to Eretz Israel. And she is a refugee, I mean, according to any definition, but she never defined herself as a refugee. She never asked to be recognized as a refugee. I'm asking it, but she never thought about herself as a refugee.
That's fantastic, Ben-Dror. I mean, fascinating stuff. I can only think the way forward is us to create a Jewish UNRWA. And we can oppose it that way. I'm not sure we'd get the votes in the United Nations, but we can always try.
Yeah.
What you have highlighted is that this is just one.
I don't hear you. I don't know if you hear me. You disappeared. Paul?
It's about understanding that. For us, it's about education. For us, it's about allowing the next generation to understand the true history of how things happen. We here in the UK and certainly around the world are struggling to come together because of the fog of history, because of all those who oppose Israel have made it so unclear that our children cannot make a distinction between what is true and what is untrue, And we are all fighting to try and keep our communities together to agree what is the best way forward for Israel in light of false historical facts. So for us, it's about that education. And so I want to thank you for coming on tonight to help us better understand just one part of that education. And hopefully, please God, you will be safe in Israel, and we will be safe, and we will allow you to come. You will be able to come here. And in person, you can tell your story so that we and our children can pass it on in a factual sense, in an honest sense. Dror, this has been a fascinating talk. I want to thank the WZO and the ZF for allowing you, for managing, for organizing this tonight. We want you to go safe and healthy and keep up. I would recommend that everybody contact Dror, have a look at his website. There's a whole lot of information that you can follow up on and you can read on that Dror will have. So
just to mention, if you allow me, my research about the Jewish NAKBA is part of my book, Industry of Lies. So it's only a small part from a huge industry, unfortunately, of lies about the Israeli-Arab conflict. So whoever wants to know much more about, there's so many lies, not because of political reasons, but because of facts, because of basic information. I can only recommend my book, Industry of Lies. You can find it through Amazon, through the internet. Anyway, thank you so much again for hosting me.
Dror, you have been fantastic and a scholar. I have been Paul Charney, chairman of the Zionist Federation. You, the audience, have been patient. Thank you so much. Go well and stay safe. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you
All right,
very
thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you, and good night, good evening.
And don't
Bye.
forget
Night.
to
Good night.
for the
Bye.
liberation of Yerushalayim.
Thank you. Bye.
תודה רבה.
Bye.
תודה פול צ'רני.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.